month begin.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to the Halloween episode of Knock Once for Yes.
It is the most spooktacular time of the year again, and it's KOFY's 4th birthday. So prepare yourself for the toddler of terror to crawl across the ceilings of your mind as we bring you HallowBirthDayWeen 4, The Spookening.
Oh, thanks for that mental image. Right, what have we got coming up on today's episode, Fitz?
We've gone back to the beginning in this special Halloween episode as we share some classic ghost stories. We've got Black Shucks, Hitchhiking Ghosts, Prom Ghosts, Banshees, time slips, and more. So pour yourself a glass of mulled wine, huddle around the fire, for the night is dark and full of terrors.
But before we get stuck into all of that Halloweeny goodness, we want to say a massive thank you to our latest patrons.
Michelle Dunham and Tony Ganji.
Mira Loves Fandom and Kerry Gleeson for upping their pledges.
And to Jamie, Seeker, Samantha and Pete for making donations through KOFY.
As always, thank you so much to all of our patrons, old and new. We couldn't do this without you, and we are eternally grateful that you enable us to continue on these weird and wonderful adventures that we love so much to share with you all.
Now, I've been a bit lazy this month, so Lil has dug out our Paranormal Radar story.
I have, and it's a bit of a pop culture one today. I know that a lot of us are excited about the upcoming TV series Truth Seekers. It's the latest project by Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, and this time they're venturing into the realms of the paranormal with a show about a cable repairman who moonlights as a paranormal investigator. Pegg and Frost are renowned for their unique brand of horror comedy, and we're looking forward to seeing their tongue-in-cheek take on the world of paranormal investigating. But in interviews about the show, they mentioned that they're not out to poke fun at the subject. Both Pegg and Frost have had an interest in the paranormal for the duration of their friendship, and they've long enjoyed swapping paranormal news and stories. Nick's interest in the paranormal bloomed early on in life. In an interview with Variety magazine, he recounts how his mother and her 6 sisters frequently talked about ghosts, and spooky fare was a common theme for him growing up. When he and Simon met, they discovered The X-Files and felt like it spoke to them personally, which of course would account for the tagline of their new show, The Truth is Way Out There. He tells of how they once had aspirations of being ghost hunters themselves and would drive out to abandoned abbeys and churches at night in the hope of having an encounter with something otherworldly. Speaking at their San Diego Comic-Con at Home panel, Nick hints that they may have experienced a few things that couldn't quite be explained. A strange mist, the sound of a bell ringing, although the one they found most eerie was stumbling across a closed-down and abandoned tube station in the middle of the forest. Frost said, "It was like we'd stepped into this completely unknown world, and that weirdly, all the lights were still on." Pegg, Frost and co-creators Nat Saunders and James Serafinowicz discuss on the panel how they used real, abandoned and potentially haunted filming locations, including a Victorian mansion, an abandoned hospital, and one of the creepiest, according to the group, a disused biolab. They also discussed some of their influences aside from the X-Files, and cited Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World and the Usborne Book of Ghosts. We spoke about this book on the show last year as it was republished by popular demand, and we now have a copy again ourselves sent to us by one of our wonderful and very generous listeners. Truth Seekers is due to be released on Amazon Prime on Friday the 30th of October, and I think that is a worldwide release date, so we are very excited to tune in.
We are both very excited to tune in, and by the time this episode is launched, that means that it should be available. So if you're listening to this, we're probably watching that.
Hurrah!
Hurrah! 2020 has unfortunately been a year of cancelled events, many paranormal ones included. But there is a bit of a silver lining. in that a lot of events have made the best of a bad situation by going virtual. One such event is Sage Paracon. Originally, this year's event was due to take place at haunted Combe Abbey in Warwickshire, but due to that which cannot be named, it has understandably been rescheduled. However, the team donned their thinking caps and came up with a way to keep us paranormal enthusiasts entertained until the in-person events can run again, and they're putting on a full 3-day online Paracon with tickets at a very affordable £12. For the last couple of years, we've longingly eyed the list of speakers at previous Sage Paracons, but the tickets have never quite been within our budget. So we leapt at this opportunity, especially when we found out that some of the speakers have recently been guests on this very show. The 3-day online event starts on Friday, January the 8th, so it's perfect to fill that post-holiday void and chase away the January blues, and will feature live lectures, Q&A sessions, music, workshops and more. We'll read you the list of some of the speakers that have been announced, and there are some very familiar names on that list. Speakers include Nick Groff, Aaron Sagers, Greg Lawson, Frank Cinelli, Nikki Folsom, Jessica Potter, Bloody Mary, The Haunt Me crew,
Yay! Haunt Me!
Robert Murch, Karen A. Dahlman, Richard Estep, Calvin Von Crush, Rick Schreck, Mark Arvia, Corin Gretton West, who you may remember as the paranormal photographer,
Yay!
Barry John, Claire Hinks, Dr. Callum Cooper, MJ Dixon, Carl Hutchinson, and more.
Oh, so many good speakers. And yeah, we had to give a little shout out to our previous guests. We're so excited and we've already got our tickets.
And just to get you warmed up for our classic ghost stories, we had a listener's letter from Seeker.
I was in the kitchen one morning about 10 years ago preparing breakfast for my 2 small daughters. While they weren't babies anymore, we still had a baby monitor. They shared a bedroom, so if we heard one of them kick off over the monitor, we could often get upstairs before the other one woke. Anyway, that morning the speaker was in the kitchen with us, and the microphone was in the girls' bedroom. I had my back to the girls, buttering their toast. The girls were trying to get my attention. Daddy. Daddy. Daddy, Daddy, Daddy. Daddy. And then, Daddy? Tingles shot up my spine as I realised this last, uncertain, fuzzy Daddy had come from the speaker, broadcasting from the empty upstairs room. I felt fortunate that my kids couldn't see my face, which was very much in the I'm scared but thrilled, I'm having a 14 experience at last mould. There were plenty of potential rational explanations for this. Baby monitors are notorious for broadcasting cross-chatter from other people's monitors, minicab radios, Russian spy rings and so on. And let's face it, if it was interference from someone else's monitor, that's just the sort of word that's likely to come through. But damn, it was still spooky. Something about the uncertainty, the question of, Daddy, really got to me. I told my wife what had happened, and we asked around the village over the next week or so. There were no other young families anywhere nearby.
Thank you, Seeker, for getting in touch with that. There is something so creepy about children's voices, and especially children's voices over baby monitors.
Just voices over baby monitors, full stop as far as I'm concerned. They are guaranteed to get the hackles raised.
And now, it's time to share some stories with you. It's Halloween, and the nights are drawing in. Leaves fade and slip from the trees to cloak the green grass in its orange and brown winter cloak. Pumpkins with glowing eyes silently watch from windows and doorsteps as misty mornings drift into short gloomy days and dark early nights. It's said that Halloween is the time of year when the veil between the living and the dead is thinnest, and it's traditional to light a candle in remembrance of past loved ones, and set out an extra place at the table should they manage to cross that veil and decide to visit. There are many other traditions from various cultures around the world, but our favourite is the sharing of stories. In particular, scary stories. So light your candles and invite your loved ones to gather close with you around the fire as we begin.
This episode is all about classic ghost stories. Some of these are modern classics, the kind of tales that teenagers whisper in shadowy huddles on Halloween night, trying to scare each other rigid. And some are the tales of legend, so deeply rooted in history that sometimes we imagine they only live on in mythology. Or do they? Paranormal stories involving banshees, Black Shuck, hitchhiking ghosts and haunted mirrors may sound like they belong in a dusty old compendium. But we wondered, were people still having encounters of this kind? Well, it seems that they are indeed. And these phantoms of legend aren't quite ready to consign themselves to the history books just yet. But our first story is more of a modern classic and involves those most shudder-worthy creatures, the Black-Eyed Kids. We've talked briefly about the Black-Eyed Kids on the show before, way back in episode 4. But if you haven't heard of what's known as the BEK phenomena before, you might want to grab a pillow to hide behind.
From what I can tell, the first reports of the black-eyed children started in the 1990s, and mostly in the United States. There have since been reports further afield, with Cannock Chase in the UK seeming to be a hotspot on this side of the pond. But wherever the experiences occur, the stories tend to follow a particular pattern. Imagine for yourself. You're sat at home one evening and the weather is cold and wet. Wrapped up against the cold and feeling a little tired, you're just thinking about heading up to bed when you're startled by a knock at the door. It's late, you're tired, and it's far too late for visitors, so you briefly consider ignoring it, and you may later wish that you had, but your conscience nags at you. Perhaps someone's been in an accident and needs help. Would you see on the news tomorrow that someone had been attacked and could have been saved if someone had merely opened the door and allowed them into safety? You'd almost already decided to open the door when the knock comes again. You just can't ignore someone in need, so you start towards the door, and as you reach to open it, you begin to feel very uneasy. Not the simple, unsettled feeling of expecting bad news from an unexpected late-night visitor, but a real chilling dread. It's too late to stop now, though. Whoever is on the other side of the door knows you're there, and you've already started to turn the handle. The feeling does stop you from opening the door all the way, though, and you peer through the crack to see two bedraggled children on your doorstep. They're dressed quite plainly, and their hair is not untidy but strikes you as being cut in quite an outdated style. Oddly, they both seem to be looking at their feet, even though you know that they're aware that you're there. Your conscience nags you again. Why aren't you inviting these children in? They must be freezing. There's obviously been some kind of accident and they need help. But you don't. That feeling of dread has risen. The cold rush of adrenaline spreads like icy fingers through your body. You don't want to let them in, but you still feel like you have to help. So you ask, "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" Then the children look up, and you see for the first time that their eyes are completely black. They ignore your questions, and with a creepy, joyless smile say, "Can we come in?" No. Some primal part of your brain, the thing that warned your ancestors about predators in the long grass, it screams at you, "No!" For most of us, the feeling of being prey is an unfamiliar one. But now you know. Whatever it is that stands before you is hungry, and you are its next meal. You try to ignore it, They're just children after all. You ask, shall I call the police? Are you hurt? Still, they ignore your questions and simply repeat, can we come in? Soon, the fear becomes too much to ignore, and you say, I'm sorry, I can't help you, and close the door, locking, latching and bolting it with everything you have to hand, and slide down to brace yourself against it. It's quiet for a moment, and your heart begins to slow from the intense pounding that you hadn't noticed until now. They gone? You lean over to peek out from the closest window, but as you move to take a look, you hear again, can we come in? That primal part of your brain again tells you, be still, be silent. And you wait, heart in your mouth, for you don't know how long. At some point the voices stop, but you don't look. Only daylight will calm your fear now. Eventually, dawn comes and your doorstep is empty. The danger is past. You can't help but check the television to see if there was an accident. Will there be two children on the news crying that their parents could have been saved if only you'd helped them? But no, there's nothing. Only that primal part of your brain again. It tells you that there would have been something on the news had you opened your door. Your house, the door hanging open, police tape and reporters on your lawn. Another chill washes over you at the thought, and you know that it might be difficult to sleep for a while. And now that you have some kind of an idea what to expect from a black-eyed children encounter, we have a story from someone that actually experienced one. The following story is an excerpt from a book, My Paranormal Autobiography by medium Emmy Spray, and this is from the 3rd chapter, The Kids in My Life, and he's kindly allowed us to share it with you.
It was a warm, late June afternoon in Atascadero, California, where I was living at the time, and I needed a few things from the grocery store a few blocks away. So I decided to go on foot just before sunset as the heat of the day had largely subsided. By the time I'd checked out at Food for Less, the local grocery outlet, the sun had set, but it wasn't completely dark yet, maybe twilight. As I carried my 2 grocery bags out past the automatic sliding door, I did notice that there was no one around me, at least within 20 feet of me. No sooner than I'd turned left to walk along the covered area where they kept the grocery carts, I heard this voice behind me, speaking to me, trying to get my attention. "Excuse me, sir." I heard this child's voice, and I suspected it was being directed towards me, but I just kept walking as though I didn't hear him. It was getting later and darker, and I wasn't in the mood to buy raffle tickets, which is what I thought this was about. "Excuse me, sir." This time it was louder and closer behind me. So while I was still walking forward, I turned to see who this was trying to get my attention. Immediately, I sensed this wasn't good news. I couldn't put my finger on it, but my first impression of this 11-year-old looking boy was just eerie with a capital E. He was dressed in dull grey and ill-fitting clothes, plain-looking pants and a button-up shirt, but clothes which didn't fit right, like they were made by someone still learning how to sew. One of the classic characteristics of a black-eyed kid is usually that their clothes don't look or fit right. With my gaze upon him, I didn't know exactly what I was interacting with, but my lifetime of paranormal experience told me that this was definitely otherworldly, and I felt like I should just keep walking, which I did. He sensed that I had him pegged, at least enough to know he was bad news. My continued walking seemed to distress him as well, but he continued to follow me about 5 or 6 feet behind. With his second, "Excuse me, sir," I turned my head to him with a defiant "yes" in the form of a question, which seemed to throw him off a little more. "Are you all right?" was his next, seemingly rehearsed line, to which I answered while picking up my pace, "I'm fine, thank you for asking." At this point, especially because I hadn't stopped to engage with him, he changed his tone and slowed his own pace, and he replied, "Enjoy the rest of your evening," was his final words to me. "You do the same," was my final words to him, and he broke off eye contact with me and changed his direction towards a parked car which was empty in the parking lot. He did not get into the car, he just stood there, frozen in time like he didn't really know what to do next. He was then standing next to the passenger side door with his left side towards me. At this point, he did something totally unexpected. He took out of his pocket a long keychain, an actual chain made of keys, maybe a chain of 20 to 30 keys, and flicked the keychain like you'd flick a yo-yo. I don't have a clue as to why he did that, but I got a creepy feeling about all those keys on his keychain. Were they car keys? Or maybe the house keys of his victims, those who didn't escape? Here's another characteristic regarding a black-eyed kid encounter. For some reason, they must ask permission beforehand from their intended victim before they can harm anyone. After dark, they'll usually knock on someone's front door, a monotonous, programmed knock. And upon answering your door, they'll say something seemingly rehearsed like, "It's food time. Don't you think you should invite me in?" Sometimes they work in groups of 2 or 3, can appear and vanish in the blink of an eye, and often appear wearing a hoodie so to hide their face, their solid black eyes. They might ask for anything, a drink of water, to use the bathroom, the phone, whatever, but they need permission of some sort to proceed, even if that permission is from another human child who is unaware of the pending danger. Almost anyone who has a black-eyed kid encounter and survives almost always has a terrible run of bad luck, automobile accidents, or becomes deathly ill. My price to pay was the latter. I already had some health issues, but within a week or so I was near death in the hospital with diverticulitis, and my family was making my funeral arrangements. Over the course of the next year, I gradually got better and recovered my health to what it was before the black-eyed kid encounter. I'll never forget the eerie feeling of dread I felt when I saw this being. Those ill-fitting clothes, the rehearsed lines, and, oh yes, I'll never forget those solid black eyes.
And thank you to Emmy Spray for allowing us to share that excerpt from his book, My Paranormal Autobiography, and we'll be putting a link in the show notes so that you can check him out later.
And if that's not enough black-eyed kid excitement for you, there are other places you can find real black-eyed child encounters, one of which is in Alan Tigwell's book, Ghosts in the Garden of England. We shared a black-eyed child encounter from that book on one of our previous episodes. Another really good place to check out would be Greg and Dana Newkirk's paranormal news website, Week in Weird. If you pop over to that site and put black-eyed kids in the search box, there are a plethora of stories and encounters that will come up for you to look at. But now, onto a story that has very deep roots in history, the Banshee.
Ireland has a rich history of paranormal tales, and one of the most famous is that of the Banshee. The legend is so famous that the phrase wailing like a banshee has become a common saying, and on the surface, that's what the Banshee are famous for, wailing. screeching, keening, a noise to curdle the blood, and this signature wail is said to announce an imminent death. Common knowledge suggests that the Banshee appears as a haggard old lady dressed in rags with red eyes from anguished tears, though oddly, given the description, they're rarely seen. Look a little deeper, and there's a little more to the story. The wail of the Banshee is said to foretell the death of a family member, as long as they're of true Irish descent. In fact, in some versions of the tale, each true Irish family has its own Banshee. It would seem that this may be a little bit of national pride at work, as it appears that both the Welsh and the Scottish have their own versions of Banshees, and they likewise visit families of only true Welsh and Scottish descent. Descriptions of her appearance also vary. Sometimes the Banshee appear as the more traditionally known haggard old lady, but sometimes she might appear as a beautiful young woman or a motherly type, very much like the Norns of Norse tradition or the triple goddess of some pagan traditions. Even the signature wail is subject to some variation, often on geographical grounds. In the east of Ireland, the Banshee is shrill. In the north, she is said to sound like wooden boards banging together, and in the southwest, the Banshee is said to sing pleasantly. Even when the Banshee wails varies. Sometimes it's the night of a death, sometimes the night before, and sometimes for several days in a row before a death. It isn't even agreed if the Banshee wail out of a desire to torture the witness or through solidarity and suffering at the loss in the family. The only thing that all the tales seem to agree on is that death is coming, and soon. We have now a story from one of our listeners, Mary Francis, who shares her grandmother's story of her childhood in Ireland, a brush with death and the Banshee's wail.
My nana grew up in the Irish Midlands on a very small farm. She was one of 8 and the first to leave home for America in the 1920s. I grew up in the 1980s in America with her telling me stories about what Ireland was like when she grew up. Our lives were quite the contrast. She grew up in a thatched cottage with all her 7 siblings and her parents in the 2 rooms. There were 2 beds. Her parents slept in one, often with the smallest child. The girls slept in the other. Her brothers slept on the floor on top of some hay. When someone was sick, they would take the chairs and benches from around the dining table and line them up for the sick child to be wrapped in blankets, sleep alone, and be close to the fire. When my nana was young, she got a terrible case of scarlet fever. She told me what she remembered about being very sick, and I'll never forget it. She said she woke up one night and could hear the wind screaming and wailing outside in a big storm. Her mother sat up in bed and screamed that she could hear the Banshee scream, and made everyone get up and kneel and pray around my grandmother. Next thing she knew, my nana woke up and a priest was giving her last rites. They were so sure about the Banshee they felt certain, including the priest, that she was going to die. She went in and out of consciousness over the next few days. Every time she woke up and opened her eyes, she saw tiny nuns pacing across the tops of the chairs that were preventing her from rolling off the bench and onto the floor. They were pacing in their black robes, praying and praying my grandmother through her delirium. That image stays with me. It still gives me a shudder. When she recovered, everyone in the village said it was a miracle the Banshee didn't get her. Someone even mentioned it to me when I was over there in the 1990s. The land my grandmother grew up on is still the property of my cousins. When I visit, they take me in wellies to the top of the highest elevation of the fields. It's called the Lachine, and it's where my family buried their dead during the famine of the 1800s. It's a place my grandmother had told me about. There are many stones up there to mark different lives lost, but over the years those are very overgrown. Still visible is one big one like a cairn to mark the sacred spot. My cousin who owns the land now doesn't farm, he's a mechanic, so he rents those fields out to other farmers all the time. Sometimes I visit and there are sheep out the back, sometimes cows. One of the last times I visited, my cousin took me up to walk the hills up to the Lachine. It's a solemn thing, and also a beautiful view of the surrounding land. He likes to talk about family history and tells me stories as we walk. It's often the first thing we do when I arrive. When we got up there the last time, I asked John, "How many of our relatives do you think are buried here?" He said, "I don't know, but tread lightly. A man I let the fields out to didn't realise what this was. He thought it would make a nice vegetable patch with all the sun it gets. With all the overgrowth, he didn't see all the stones. He put a spade to the ground to turn the earth, and a bone came right up." We were silent for a moment. I said, "How awful, what did he do?" And my cousin said, "He turned it back to the earth, told me what happened, and didn't renew his lease." Later at the pub, I asked John if he had any ghost stories about those fields. He said, "I don't believe in spirits," and changed the subject. But I can't look out the back window there at night without a shudder.
And thank you to Mary for sharing that story.
I've never been to Ireland, but it's a place that definitely needs to go at the top of our list. There are so many amazing places. I'd love to visit there.
Apparently I've got some relatives in Cork, so they might even be able to take us round.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Indeed. It's time now for our next classic paranormal story, and this one involves a time slip. Perhaps the most famous of these stories is the Versailles time slip, where in 1901, Charlotte Moberly, the president of St Hugh's College in Oxford, and Eleanor Jourdain, her assistant, were visiting the French royal palace at Versailles. Not much impressed with the main palace, they decided to walk the grounds and visit the smaller Trianon palaces. They were to each have several unusual experiences during their walk, however, including seeing various people in late 1700s attire, and described some buildings and garden features that they were unable to locate again on subsequent visits. They also stated that they both became uncomfortable and the atmosphere changed. Moberly would later write about this. Everything suddenly looked unnatural, therefore unpleasant. Even the trees seemed to become flat and lifeless, like wood worked in tapestry. There were no effects of light and shade, and no wind stirred the trees. Perhaps most astonishingly, Moberly saw a lady with fair hair making sketches on the grass, and after later seeing a portrait of Marie Antoinette, believed the French Queen was who she had witnessed that day. The pair later published a book about their experiences, and there were various explanations put forward by critics and skeptics to dismiss them. From the rather convincing, such as Robert de Montesquieu, who came forward to confirm that he regularly held parties with guests in period costume there, to the somewhat less convincing argument that the ladies were having some kind of shared delusion. Skeptics seem happy that the experiences have been debunked, but there are some intriguing points that I can't seem to dismiss. First, while de Montesquieu did hold period dress parties there was not one occurring on the day of the ladies' visit. Second, the ladies had some identical experiences, but some were quite different, and each saw some people that the other did not, even though they were together. One might think that if they were perpetrating a hoax, that they might attempt to ensure that their stories were more consistent. But perhaps the most intriguing point for me is that they both described certain buildings and garden features that, as I mentioned earlier, they were unable to locate on later visits. Skeptics believed that they had simply mistaken the area that they believed they were in, but, much later, plans of the gardens were discovered that showed the very building they described, and in the very spot in which they saw it. I have undoubtedly skimmed over the story here, and there is a wealth of information to cover if you wish to delve into the case further. From the book written under pseudonyms by the ladies themselves, the various articles sceptical of their claims, as well as an Anglia television dramatisation and a BBC radio dramatisation of the incident. For me though, one of my favourite time-slip stories is one that I read as a child. It first appeared in the book World of Strange Phenomena and tells of two English couples holidaying in France in 1979. They were looking for a place to stay, and at the first hotel they came across they were turned away as the hotel was full, but they were recommended to carry on a little way as there was another hotel nearby. The couples shortly found themselves travelling down a narrow cobbled street, where they came across an old-fashioned building bearing a sign labelled Hotel. Inside they found it somewhat rustic, with everything made of heavy wood. There were no modern conveniences, and even the windows had no glass but simple wooden shutters. In spite of the lack of facilities, the couples enjoyed their stay and took plenty of photographs of their visit. In the morning they headed downstairs for breakfast, and were surprised when two gendarmes entered wearing uniforms they'd not seen before. They looked very antiquated and even had cloaks. Asking the gendarmes for directions, they merely believed that their French was less than adequate when they struggled to get across the idea of an auto route, and were surprised yet again when settling up for their stay, only to be charged 19 francs. They double-checked with the hotelier. 2 rooms, 2 meals for 4, yes, is all in order. This is bearing in mind that they would expect to pay 250 francs for an overnight stay and a meal at a more modern hotel. They continued on to enjoy the rest of their holiday and decided on the return home that they should stay again at the pleasant little rustic hotel. They found the road and familiar signs, but were unable to find the hotel itself again. They searched for a little while, but eventually they had the idea of checking again the hotel they'd stopped at first on their initial visit and had been given directions from. They found this hotel easily enough, but when they again asked for directions to the little rustic hotel, the clerk wasn't familiar with it, and when they described the man that had recommended it in the first place, he said there was no one of that description that worked there either. Disappointed, but by this time beginning to realise something strange had occurred, they gave up their search and found another room for the night. There is one last interesting point to the story. When they returned home, they developed the rolls of film that they'd taken on their holiday. None featured the little rustic hotel. That isn't to say that they were poorly exposed or otherwise faulty pictures. They were simply not there. No negatives, nothing. However, on examination, it appears that in the places of the film that the pictures should have been, there was damage to the sprocket holes of the film, as if the cameras had attempted to wind on the film, but were unable to do so. We have another time-slip story for you now, and this one was kindly provided by Jamie Tapsell.
It was Halloween 2015, which fell on a Sunday just after the full hunter's moon. The spiritualist church by my house provides a drop-in service on Sundays, so I decided to attend with my friend. There were songs and prayers, and the evening finished with a guest medium relaying messages to those in the congregation. The medium told me that a motherly figure was looking over me, and was happy to see that I was in a relationship with the man sitting next to me. This was a surprise, as my mother is very much still alive, and the friend sitting next to me had been in a relationship with a man for the past few years. Feeling a tad cheated, we decided to head to the local pub for some Halloween drinks. It was an incredibly cold evening with frozen fog twisting throughout the streets. My friend and I had a very normal couple of hours in the pub, slow-paced drinking to avoid inebriation as we both had work the following morning. On the walk home, which began at around 10:30 p.m, we decided to cut through the cemetery as the gates are always open and the lights are always on. This felt like the safer option, as the fog was so bad we could barely see 6 feet ahead, even with the torch from our smartphones. The walk should have taken no more than 20 minutes. When we entered the cemetery, which was well lit, we both started to feel weird. We became incredibly anxious and started panicking for no justifiable reason. We began walking very quickly and decided it was best to leave the cemetery at the next gate. I know this cemetery very well, as I always walk my dog there, so I knew there would be a gate coming up on the right-hand side. The gate did not materialise, so I rationalised this by suggesting that the bushes had been neglected and the gate must be on the other side of the overgrowth. We climbed through the bushes, and when we came out the other side, there was no gate and no cemetery. Instead, we'd somehow been transported at least a mile away to a separate forest known locally as Hangman's Wood, and the time was 2 a.m. Confused, we both tried to work out what had just happened. We were both further away from home than we would have been had we continued through the cemetery in a completely separate part of town. To this day, we still have no idea what happened, how we got there, or how 3 or so hours passed in what seemed like 15 minutes.
Thank you, Jamie, for sharing that amazing story.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, like she says, it's a place she knows really well and she walks there all the time. And how can you just end up a mile away, missing 3 hours? What happened? That is a really, really incredible one.
Very strange.
Well, from time slips to beasts of legend now. Stick with us a while longer as we continue on our journey through the classic ghosts. Next up is the Black Shuck.
Terrifying ghostly hounds are a staple of British legend, and depending on where you are in the country, they go by different names. If you listen to our recent episode with Dorian Deathley, you may have heard them called Barguest, but out our way, they're called Black Shuck. A large black dog with glowing red eyes and bared teeth. Shuck's horrifying howl chills the blood, and to encounter Shuck, prowling at night, is to foretell your own death within the year. Or, if the tale from Abraham Fleming in 1577 is to be believed, rather more imminently than that, as he writes that Shuck burst into St Mary's Church in Bungay on the 4th of August of that year and wrung the necks of some praying congregants. We had believed that the accounts of Black Shuck were to be found only in the annals of history, but we've been surprised on a few occasions on our research to come across some more modern accounts. One of our favourite go-to research books is The Roadmap of British Ghosts by Ruth Roper Wilde, who you may also remember from episode 36. She shares several recent reports of Black Shuck in the book, of which my favourite is the story which takes place on the B869, an isolated stretch of road in the far northwest of Scotland. A friend of mine was walking back from Lachine one night, and as he reached Craganordane, he heard a splashing in the water of the loch, and a great black dog with eyes like burning peats came out of the water and up the bank towards him. It growled as it came out of the water, and as it did so, sparks flew from its mouth. The poor man was terrified and fled along the road as fast as his legs could carry him. The dog, though, was faster and soon overtook him. As it turned to face him, he stood face to face with the beast. It was a terrifying sight, with a half-human face with horns on its head. It growled and snarled, and the poor man was quaking with fear, but he kept on walking, as there was nowhere for him to run. The dog belched fire and growled, but did not attack him, before, just as suddenly as it appeared, it disappeared straight into the middle of the road. It was many days before he would walk that road again, even in broad daylight.
Thank you so much to Ruth for allowing us to share that excerpt from her book, The Roadmap of British Ghosts. In fact, there are a surprising number of contemporary sightings of Black Shuck, and we have another for you right now, sent to us from Kian of the Wide Atlantic Weird podcast.
Hello, Lil and Fitz. It's Kian here from the Wide Atlantic Weird podcast. Thank you very much for having my ghost story on the show. This is literally the only semi-inexplicable thing that has ever happened to me in a career and a life of taking an interest in strange and spooky stories. Anybody who knows my show knows that I am usually the first person to reach for an ordinary explanation whenever anything seems weird. And yet, having had this happen to me, this is literally the only one story that's ever happened to me that I kind of struggle to find a regular explanation for. It's only a small thing, it's a short thing, but it was pretty scary at the time. So this is about the legend of the Black Shuck, or the Black Dog. To me, it's primarily a very English phenomena. There's a lot of folklore associated with it that I'm sure many listeners will be familiar with. The basic story is that the Black Shuck is a kind of a supernatural being that appears to travelers on lonely country lanes, usually in the shape of an oversized black dog, sometimes with blazing eyes of yellow or red, sometimes with just one single eye. Now, there are cases of this from all over different parts of the UK and to a lesser degree in Ireland as well. The version of it I'm most familiar with is the one that is known by the name of Black Shuck, and that's what it's called in most parts of East Anglia. And I came across a lot of stories like this while I lived in Essex, because that's a part of the country deeply associated with this story. But weirdly, the only time something like this ever happened to me was quite far away in Canada. So about 2017, I was living and working at a reasonably remote location in sort of mid to upper Ontario. And I worked at a fairly remote place up in what Canadians call cottage country. And what that means to us is it's where well-off people have second homes, places where they go on holidays. And it's all of these houses, and often they are lake houses, are surrounded by forest. And each house would be sort of half a mile to a mile apart, if not more, because they have quite a lot of property. So the place I was working at was within about 40 minutes walk from the nearest tiny little town. And I'm sure a lot of listeners will know that over on that side of the pond, they have vastness of space and distance that are more than much of what we have here. And therefore, you can feel a lot more alone, a lot more remote than most places in the UK or in Ireland. So there was a tiny little crossroads, about 40 minutes walk through the forest, and that was the nearest little burg, and it had, of all things, a craft brewery. So sometimes on an evening off, on a quiet one, I would walk down to sort of read the paper and have a pint of ale or something like that. And this meant sometimes people would come with me, sometimes not. But on this particular occasion, I was walking by myself. So it was a classic setup. You're on your own. You're walking through this forest. There's nothing around you. And basically the sun was going down. It was kind of October time, about this time of year, actually, which is a good time to see spooky things in the forest. So what happened was I had to step off the track or the trail, which is always a no-no in folk stories. through the call of nature, shall we say. So, just finding myself a little spot in the woods where I wouldn't be visible even if somebody did come by, but this was a very remote sort of a country lane, and something appeared out of the corner of my eye that absolutely, categorically had not been there a moment earlier. Now, it was gloomy, it was getting on dark, but it was not pitch black, and I had done a quick check of the little grove I was in, and this thing that I saw did not come out of the forest, it did not walk into the grove. It had just 1 minute it was not there, and the next thing it was. And it was a large pitch black dog, about the size of a Great Dane, and absolutely had not been there a moment earlier. Didn't make a sound. It came towards me. It was maybe up to my shoulder. I'm not a tall fellow, but it was perhaps up to my shoulder. And in my shock, because I wasn't expecting this, I took a step backwards and it vanished, basically. So, there are possible explanations for this, I suppose. It's not impossible that a dog owned by one of the distant houses in the forest could have had a dog that was wandering out like that. Not impossible, just the fact that it strikes me as incredibly unlikely that it would have been there without my noticing. And that's strictly down to sort of my own interpretation of what happened. But I was, of course, as a fan of ghost stories and folklore, I was reminded of the Black Shuck of legend. And it's always kind of stuck with me in my head. And I've always thought it remarkable that for all of the time I spent in the UK, it was not until I was in the wilds of Canada that I ever came across something that kind of fitted with that ghost story folklore template. So that's my short ghost story. Thanks very much for having it. And I hope the listeners enjoy it.
Thank you, Cian, for sharing that story. That was an amazing story. Now, like you say, it's possible that it was a dog from the local houses, but
how would something that big creep up on you when you just check the area? And I don't know about you, but when I'm having to, use the woods for that purpose, I'm pretty meticulous about checking what's around me. I'd have noticed if there was something there, especially something that size.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a huge, shoulder-sized dog is going to crunch a few twigs and leaves when it walks, no matter how stealthy it's trying to be.
You'd think, but as he mentions, it's odd that it was in Canada. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether there are many incidences of these sort of black dog apparitions or phenomena in Canada, but I'd love to know if any Canadians can enlighten us.
Funnily enough, that does actually feed in quite well to our next story. As well as paranormal animals such as Black Shuck, there are also creatures that blur the line between human and animal, such as werewolves and skinwalkers. Skinwalkers are of Native American origin, but over the last few decades they've begun to feature often in non-Native American storytelling and pop culture. Generally, they're described as malevolent witches who can transform themselves into animals, but it's important to note that a lot of what we found in our research is that skinwalkers are deeply rooted in the history and legend of the Navajo and other tribes of the Southwest, and that, understandably, this lore is only shared with those who the tribes trust implicitly. As you can imagine, this means that a lot of the lore we may think we know about these mysterious beings could well stem more from modern horror culture than from history. That said, it seems that encounters with skinwalkers can and do happen to people of all cultures and backgrounds, and in fact we have one such encounter to share with you right now. Long-time listeners will remember Marcus D of the One Candle Society YouTube channel and the Talking with Shadows podcast from our interview with the One Candle guys way back in episode 7. He believes that he may just have had his own run-in with a skinwalker.
Hey guys, thank you so much for taking my story and allowing me to share it out there for anybody who wants to listen to it. My name is Marcus D, and I am the co-host of the paranormal podcast, Talking with Shadows. And I do my podcast with my co-host, Vic Waitley. And I would definitely say that between the two of us, I am by far the more skeptical. And I mean, it's just how I approach the paranormal. If there's a way that I can try to explain something logically, I'm just going to try to do it. I think that it ends up making the stories that you can't explain all the more better. And I definitely had one of those kind of personal experiences a couple years ago. A couple years ago, I probably had the most intense paranormal encounter that I've ever had. And me and my co-host really wanted to do a story on skinwalkers as a topic. And if you guys don't know what skinwalkers are, they're Native American Navajo witches from the Southwest that can do things like curse people. Reportedly, they can turn into things like werewolf-like creatures or werebird-like creatures. And they terrorize the Southwest, essentially. And there's not a whole lot of information that's really out there on these things. And we thought it would be really, really interesting to see if we could like dig deeper and try to do some kind of story for, our podcast. And so I went out and I was trying to see if there was any books that I could find. And there's, again, not a whole lot of information on skinwalkers, but I found 2 books by Gary and Wendy Swanson. And they're Bigfoot researchers here in America. And they, go out and try to collect stories of Bigfoot and whatnot. But through their research, they started hearing a lot of stories about skinwalkers. And so they finally decided to go out and see if they can find some more information on skinwalkers and find whatever research they can on these things. So I bought both of their books. I bought the book, trying to remember what it was called. The Last Skinwalker. That's what it was called. The Last Skinwalker, The Avenging Witch of the Navajo Nation. And about their other book, Skinwalkers, Shape Changers, and Native American Curses. And they're both really good books. And I got the first book first, and I got it in the mail, and I was so excited when it came in, because the book had really good reviews, and it was supposed to have some stuff in there for me to really sink my teeth into on some real in the field kind of stories. And so the first night that I get it, I take my book, I go outside on my back porch, I bring my dog, my little beagle with me, and I got a drink with me, and I just start reading the book. And then, I get the book, I'm texting all my friends. I'm super excited that I got this. And I'm like texting like play-by-plays of the book, like super excited. And while I'm reading the book, Gary and Wendy talk about going out and having a really hard time finding anybody to talk to them about skinwalkers. And they couldn't figure out why until they finally got a contact from the Navajo Nation to sit down and meet with them. But their contact said that, I'm only going to meet with you during the day. I'm only going to meet with you in public. So they go out to eat like brunch or lunch or something. And they're sitting down meeting with their contact. And he starts talking to them all about skinwalkers and their lore and their legend, where they come from. And while he's talking to them, he'll randomly change the conversation, like mid-sentence even. Like he'll just be talking about skinwalkers, and all of a sudden he'll start talking about football. Or he'll be talking about skinwalkers a little bit later, and then all of a sudden he'll change the conversation to the weather, just out of nowhere. And it's totally taking Gary and Wendy back. And I don't understand, while I'm reading, while he's doing this either, why this is going on. And then they finally ask him, they're like, why are you changing the subject? And he like points to like, it was either some trees or some bushes that are behind them or something like that. And he told them that he saw like a deformed animal or something that was in the trees or bushes that was watching them. And he said, one of the things about skinwalkers that you need to understand is when you talk about them, they know you're talking about them. They're aware of it. And they will send animals and beasts to spy on you while you're talking about them or to learn more about you. And so that's why he's totally changing the subject mid-sentence talking about them. And Gary and Wendy just are flabbergasted by this. And I am too. And so they finish their meeting with the guy, and then they have a whole bunch of other just bad things happen to them in the book. While they're researching these things, their car gets broken into, the hotel they're staying at burns to the ground. It was just a bad experience. Like, skinwalkers do not want you learning more about them. So while I'm reading the book and I'm out there with my dog and I'm reading, under starlight, it's awesome. All of a sudden, my dog stands straight up at attention, and she's staring out into my backyard. And my back porch light kind of shines kind of like a circle in the middle of my backyard, just creates this like circle of light. And my dog is like staring directly at this circle. And as I'm looking out there, all of a sudden, 5 feet away from me at most, a black shadow-like dog walks right into the light, like into the middle of the light, full-fledged shadow dog. And my dog is just locking eyes with this thing. Now, again, I've lived here in this town for years. I know what a raccoon looks like. I know what dog animals look like. I know, this thing is just fully made of shadow. There's no, and it's not casting a shadow from somewhere else because there's no like shadow lines back into the shadows or anything. It is just a full shadow animal that is standing in this circle of light. And my dog has locked eyes with it. And my dog barks at everything. She'll bark at nothing. She'll make all sorts of noises. And she was just dead silent, staring at this dog. And we just sat in silence for several minutes until this thing just walked back into the shadows. And I grabbed my book, I grabbed my dog, I left the drink, and I just went back inside, and I was just done. I'm like, nope. I had both of these books. I read them both, but I'm telling you now, I only read them during the day after that. So I hope you guys enjoyed my story, and once again, I'm really glad that you guys decided to listen to it.
Oh, Marcus, you are not wrong. That was seriously intense.
It was. We were both sort of sat here and we're like, this is interesting, and this is kind of what we found in our research, and then boom.
We were just looking across the room at each other, watching each other's eyes get wider and wider as the story progressed. I think you're brave to have finished the books. I know you said you read them in daylight, but I think if I'd have had that experience, I think I would have been putting them in the next door neighbour's bin, or taking them to the tip, or burying them in the back garden, or just getting as far away from them as I possibly could.
Is it that, or is it just what I need to know to protect myself?
No, that's a good point. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power.
Thank you again, Marcus. And if you'd like to hear more of Marcus, then don't forget that you can find him on the One Candle Society YouTube channel and the Talking with Shadows podcast. And everybody that's a podcaster that's been featured on today's show, we'll put links in the description so you can find Marcus, you can find Kian, and we've got some more podcast stories coming up for you as well, so keep an ear out for those.
But now we have a story from Joanna Veranda for the next of our classic ghosts, the Haunted Mirror. For something that we think of as such a humble household object, the simple mirror certainly has quite a bit of folklore attached to it. Of course, we all know about the penalty of 7 years bad luck for breaking a mirror, but there's a lot more folklore from many cultures surrounding mirrors. There's Bloody Mary, of course, but I think that probably the next most well-known mirror lore is covering any mirrors in the house following a death, and until the body is buried, lest the soul of the departed be trapped within the mirror. It's also suggested that you do not sleep with a mirror facing your bed, as your soul might be pulled into it as you sleep, and your mental defences are lowered. It's not all bad, though. The Chinese would hang mirrors to scare away evil spirits, and looking at yourself in the mirror is said to draw your troubles to the other side. Just don't do it for too long, or it'll suck your soul out too. There are even a few Halloween traditions that young unmarried ladies could use to see their future spouse in a mirror. And divination in general is also a common use for mirrors, the psychomantium being one, and you may hear a little bit more about that in the future. Mirrors then have a long history of being a portal to the other side, and our next story is from someone that has experienced this personally. Now, this story is a true encounter, but fully embracing the spirit of Halloween, Joanna Veranda wrote up her experience in the style of a classic Victorian ghost story, and how could we refuse that?
Readers, be forewarned. For the tale which I am about to impart is not an absolute truth, yet not a single lie is contained therein. It is of common knowledge that memories commence to deceive us once we are past the sensitivities of early infancy. Incidents that we might have perceived as unquestionable grow up to reveal themselves as naught but reveries of our tender minds. For this reason, you will undoubtedly mistrust the veracity of this narrative. You will undoubtedly presume me stark mad. Alas, I am too close to my witching hour to remain preoccupied with any presumptions directed towards me any more. What truly matters to me at this very moment is that I recount this tale in some form or shape, lest I should turn stark mad myself. Having become a personage of a certain age, and without any caring relatives or friends, I have begun to begrudge the possibility of carrying this secret untold to the depths of my isolated grave. I could and should have made a record of it much sooner, especially to those which I had considered bosom friends. Their jovial good humour had me in permanent fear of embarrassment or jaunty judgment, but I'd rather trust now that they would have unquestionably appreciated that I'd shared a further substantial portion of my deeper self with them, instead of the evasion of privacy which I had presented them with at all times. If I had done so, perhaps they would still be here. Alas, they were both a blessing and a curse. I was professed by them to be of a courageous spirit from the start, and without exception even in the direst fits of depression. Though here indeed rests the ghastliest lie of my entire existence, for not a single ounce of bravery I believe I have ever possessed. I suspect that the aura of charisma that I unwillingly obtained all these years was naught but a fake persona I created in order to incapacitate others of denoting my veritable demeanour, which is as a coward and a wretch. And this I expect to have performed since my tenderest age, for reasons that I shall essay to show below. My agony began nigh on 3 years old, or perhaps sooner, considering what I aforementioned explained, that there is only so much our limited brains can recollect from our infant span. Accordingly, you could, at this point, even hint at the likelihood of my musings being simply nothing else than a trick of the young mind, remembrances of a feverish child's late-night dreams, or even a very advanced creative brain power. Sadly, I inform you that the events which I am imparting to you span across many years, leading their very way into my adult life. Thus, I must begin by referring to the first few years of my existence as having been subject to the company of an elder brother, a mother, and a father, the latter one very absent due to his occupation as a travelling merchant. These 3 first presences in my catalogue of acquaintances were not ones that any carefree young person would have desired. My older sibling had to begrudgingly take on the role of shielding me both from my father's absence and my mother's presence at a very young age. This of course did not last long, just about until his mind gave in to the responsibility of the task. As a grown man, it became desperately obvious to see that he did not remain unscathed from this ordeal, and perchance neither did I. Although I believe I was able to deal with it a fair amount better than he did in the years to come in which I had to learn how to fend for myself. But as contradictory as it may sound, I never considered myself to have suffered through an unhappy childhood, conceivably due to my solitary resourcefulness. It was only in my adult life that I realised my suffering was real. At any rate, one of my earliest memories was of trudging on all fours along my childhood house's only corridor from the nursery towards the kitchen, where my mother and brother were cooking. I drearily recall looming at the threshold of the kitchen door and looking up to greet them, when of a sudden I felt my feet being pulled away from me. Upon gazing at the darkness behind me, I saw nothing, therefore continued towards my family regardless, albeit despondently. As I loomed again at my initial destination, some unspeakable force then pulled me with such strength that I had to begin to cry in desperation, hoping that someone would come and release me from my plight. My mother and brother rushed to find me in the middle of the long corridor, entirely on my own. This was not the only time this dreadful passage was to become the stage of my traumatic frights. Years later, I initiated the habit of running from the lavatories to the nursery, one at each end of this accursed corridor, because at times, whilst passing a mirror located in its intermediate area, I used to see the reflection of an old, wrinkled woman standing behind me. The first time I saw her, I believed, as you must do when reading this recollection of memories, that I was merely observing an optical illusion caused by a deceit of the lighting or even a demonstration of my undeveloped wit. Parallelly, I was also a very lonely child with no one to be at leisure with, and it's customary at these ages for young people to create imaginary friends to have some sort of entertainment. Yet, I assure you, this woman seemed to me as corporeal as any other human form that could be reflected by means of that mirror. In my innocence, however, I did indeed believe her to be there to play with me, mayhaps as divine answer to my never-ending prayers of wanting to have a friend. Hence why after I saw her and concluded her not to be a trick of the light, I leapt up in glee, up and down the corridor, looking into the mirror again and again and smiling at her. Yet she never smiled. Until one day, I grew bored of her as children do when things remain unchanged. Staring into the reflection, I pursed my lips at her, and in a moment her countenance finally changed into a featureless grin, eyes blackened, frightening me. After that, I could not bear to look at her any more, and remained with no other option than to shun her entirely. But none of these happenings were as appalling as what I am about to convey to you in the succeeding portion of this tale. Presently I can scarce even recognise my own handwriting. Letters appearing to flow from my pen trembled crooked, out of fear, excitement, or pure disbelief, I do not know. All I am certain of is that I have never revealed this to anyone, and the relief of unblocking it from my chest feels unsurmountable. Thus, I am quite hopeful that you will continue to read this story, and that I have somehow enticed your curiosity towards my lifelong predicament. One night, long after my family members had settled in, and my brother had bid me his nocturnal goodbyes from his cot across the nursery, I woke up with a silent stir, a shuffling of fabric, and a quiet sob. Unaware of the source of this commotion, which I wish now 1,000 times that I'd simply dismissed the first time, I lifted my head to inspect my surroundings. I hoped to have confirmed my brother's figure near my cradle, attempting to playfully extend our activities past the permissible hours. Instead, I came to contemplate the old hunching woman that had grinned at me from the looking-glass. I could plainly see her now, standing in the darkness, wearing a purple cloak, gazing at me from the foot of my bed. This occasion was to be repeated quite a few times until I came to the realization that what I had thus far seen was not under the realms of normality. I began to instigate myself to ignore this visitation, using the covers as my concealment as I waited for those ethereal sobs to either vanish or be forgotten on the way to a deeper slumber. But forget them I did not. Slightly older, I expressed to my mother my qualms of seeing someone scuttering about me in the room frequently, in the corridor and even in the mirror. She raised a suspicious eyebrow to me at first. However, shortly after, as she somehow comprehended that this was no mere childish invention, she finally decided to take me to a medium of sorts. This is the point where my memories most fail me, where unbounded imagination comes to blend with fact, for all I can recollect is a yellow room, a smell of camphor, and a vile old seer with grey hair in a bun. I dare say vile indeed, despite of her apparent holiness, as her chambers were covered from floor to ceiling entirely with figures of Jesus in a cross, Mary and other Christian effigies. At this time I'd been taught that these were symbols of hope and healing, but as I grew up, I found that whenever I called upon these religious mementos, there was naught else there but the painful sting of the void. None of them ever came to my aid in my most wretched of times. I do not have the faintest clue as to what this witch did to me, yet after this, the purple-cloaked woman never showed herself to me again. Not entirely, at least. Perchance it was also this witch's fault that I was to feel disconnected from all spirituality for the rest of my life. Alas, my esteemed reader, this is not the end of this tale. Many years onwards, after I'd quite dismissed all I've shared with you thus far as frightful fantasies, my mother stole away into the night in a fit of insanity, disappearing from our lives forever and taking every single penny we had with her. Broken homeless, my father had no choice but to take me and my brother back to his unclaimed birth home. When his own father had passed away years ago, he had left us with a great deal of objects and some money, though everything had remained untaken until then due to pride. My brother and I were never even presented with the opportunity to know him properly, nor did we ever see our grandmother, as she had perished postpartum whilst giving birth to my father. Nevertheless, our grandfather had made a generous note of leaving an inheritance for his shamefully neglected son, as well as symbolic objects to both of his grandchildren. My elder sibling received his rifle and some carpenter tools, whilst I was given a wooden trunk that had belonged to my grandmother. For years it had sat untouched in the top story of the old house since her untimely demise, without so much as anyone having checked what had been left inside. As we climbed up the steps to the attic, my father recapped me on his past memories of this item before it had been locked away. He had last seen it in mint condition, beautifully handcrafted in pine and steel. Most likely now, with the passing of the ages, it would be in need of some repairs. Cheerfully, he informed me that he would perform them with me in an attempt to make up for the affection which he had failed to provide, not unlike his own father. He was not lying. The item was gorgeous and hitherto shockingly pristine. I was very pleased with this gift, my mind racing instantly through the myriad of ways I could give it new life. I opened the trunk with a flushing gust of excitement running through me, knowing that I was the first person to lay eyes on its contents for a very long time. Inside, there was a single parcel, wrapped in decaying cloth and dried up sprigs of lavender, and inside this parcel was a folded purple cloak. After this revelation, I had no choice but to seek out another medium that could properly reveal to me this time just what kind of nightmare I had been forcibly involved with all my life. This new trustworthy woman confirmed to me my direst suspicions. I had been cursed by my own grandmother, for I was the next female in line after she had died giving birth to my father. The accounts I had heard of her from next of kin when I was a child had described her as a lovely young girl whose spark had been taken away too soon. Yet what I have always felt lurking within my innards, darkening my path wherever I tried to go, brushing past me in wisps of anguish in the murkiest hours of the night, has never felt kind or caring. She was envious of me, is desperately envious. She even went as far as to make my own mother mad. The medium I contacted did her best to guide her into the light, and for a time it felt good. But she came back. I feel her again, or in hindsight perhaps she never truly went away. I never felt unbridled happiness. I was never successful in any endeavour. I have only had a handful of loyal friends which are gone now, and I have never even felt loved. I have fallen into a pit of depression and anxiety and panic of which I cannot get out any more, for the walls have been made plain from all the attempts I have made to get out. I have tried everything to get rid of her. Everything except telling her story.
And thank you, Joanna, for sharing that story with us. And we did enjoy the Victorian ghost story format. I would say that we do both believe very strongly that there is a power in sharing stories, and that the sharing of an experience can lessen its grip on you. And so that I hope that this helps, and if nothing else, that it provides you with a catharsis.
We're getting a little bit more modern now, as next we're looking at Hitchhiking Ghosts.
We've all heard the classic Hitchhiking Ghost story in one form or another. It usually begins, as all classic ghost stories do, on a dark and stormy night. Or at least a dark and rainy night, when a lone male driver, squinting through his foggy windscreen into the gloom of the soaking night, spots a young woman standing at the side of the road, drenched to the skin, with only a flimsy dress to protect her from the elements. Concerned, the driver pulls over and asks if she needs a ride home. Gratefully, the shivering girl mumbles a nearby address and slides into the back seat. The worried driver passes his coat to the back of the car for her to borrow until he can get her home. And all the while he's wondering what a lone young lass like this is doing out on such a wicked night. And so he drives, just wanting to get her to safety. The address she gave isn't far, and the driver glances behind him to announce, "Here we are." But he's met with only darkness. The girl is gone. Flustered and confused, he stops the car, gets out, whirls around, straining his eyes in the rain and the darkness to see where she could have gone, and how she could have left the car without him knowing. He can't have imagined it, can he? But no. There on the back seat, the borrowed coat rests against a slightly damp patch where the soaked young woman had been sitting. Distressed that he's somehow lost his charge, and determined that he must at least notify her parents or whoever resided at her address so that they could look for her, he approaches the house. All the windows are dark, and no one is stirring within, but he knocks and waits anxiously. After a time, a small, grey and tired-looking older lady cracks the door, cautiously peeking out into the black night. But when the stranger relates his tale, a note of panic in his voice, she opens the door a little wider. Her face and shoulders fall as he explains, and her eyes soften with a look of almost apologetic sadness. Behind the lady, a photo on the wall catches the driver's eye. That's the girl, there in the photo. She's even wearing the same dress as tonight. His attention is pulled back to the woman, who is now resting a soft hand on his arm and looking him directly in the eye as she tells him, "Yes, that was my daughter. Thank you for trying to help, but please don't trouble yourself looking for her. We know exactly where she is. You see, she died some years ago now, in a road accident, and is buried in the cemetery just down the road. But you're not the first driver who's knocked on our door late at night, with the same story you just told me." Or at least that's one version of the story, but as with all tales that enter the annals of folklore, many different versions spring up across the years. In some, the girl is wearing a scarf or coat which she leaves in the car, and the driver continues to the address she gave to return it. In others, she borrows his coat, but it disappears along with the girl. He finds it later, hanging on a gravestone in the local cemetery. But is there any truth to the legend? Well, in Britain, the name most often thought of as synonymous with the hitchhiking ghost tale is that of Bluebell Hill in Kent. And this is actually a bit odd because although this may well be Britain's most famous road ghost, the reports of an actual phantom hitchhiker on this stretch of Kent Road are few and far between, and often seem to originate from a friend of a friend, making them hard to verify. But despite this, the reputation has stuck over the years. But Bluebell Hill certainly does have some very strange and seemingly unexplainable stories to tell, and often the stories feature many elements present in the Hitchhiking Ghost classic tale. In this case, the truth is almost stranger than the myth. I've never visited Bluebell Hill in Kent, and when I'm researching a place, I like to get a lay of the land, a feel for the place, if you will, and I find maps very helpful for this. Perusing an internet map, Bluebell Hill, linking Medway and Maidstone in Kent, looks to me, at first glance, like a nightmarish tangle of motorway and dual carriageway with huge roundabouts looping their way down into the seventh circle of hell, and underneath all of this, a high-speed railway burrows beneath the chalk hill, whipping by unseen underneath all the chaos and traffic above. It reminds me of that quote from Good Omens about the M25 and gives me a small shudder. But how you see a place is all about perspective, and so I decide to switch mine and pull up a different kind of map instead. An ordnance survey that shows me all the interesting stuff beyond the roar of the traffic. Yes, I know, I'm not sponsored by Ordnance Survey, I promise, but I probably should be. The contour lines show me how steep the chalk hill is. I can see it's home to a nature reserve, and that the banks are heavily wooded. The North Downs Way National Trail skirts the woods of its slopes, and even more fascinatingly, an ancient prehistoric trackway known as the Pilgrim's Way cuts across the bottom. Now, it's getting interesting. The route of the Pilgrim's Way leads me to notice that the A229 dual carriageway runs parallel to the route of an old Roman road, whilst to the west of the modern road lie the prehistoric Medway megaliths, Kit's Coty House and the Countless Stones, both Neolithic chamber tombs. I also notice, with a harumph bordering on the ironic, that in the opposite corner of this small square of map sits a modern crematorium. This site feels like it has the potential for some very strange energies indeed. Well, strange energies or not, Bluebell Hill was most certainly host to some incredibly strange phenomena in the year of 1992. At just before midnight, on Sunday the 8th of November 1992, coach driver Ian Sharp finished his shift and hopped in his car to head home. Taking his usual route down Bluebell Hill towards Maidstone, a route he knew like the back of his hand, he was surprised to see a woman standing at the side of the dual carriageway. Travelling at about 50 miles an hour, he kept an eye on her but knew she must see his oncoming car. So he was shocked and horrified when she ran straight out in front of his vehicle. In the horrifying moments during which he was desperately trying to brake, the young woman looked right through the windscreen and locked eyes with his. He could see that she was wearing a light-coloured coat with some kind of roll neck or blouse underneath, that she had shoulder-length blonde hair, a roundish face, and big eyes. Eyes that penetrated his. Eyes that would haunt his memories for years to come. No matter how desperately he braked, he never would have been able to stop in time, and the girl seemed to be swallowed up by the bonnet of the car. In shock and trembling with fear, Ian leapt from the vehicle, terrified by the thought of what he would find when he got out. He was expecting a body, but what he found was nothing. When the woman was nowhere to be seen, he steeled himself to do the unthinkable and look under the car, but there was nothing there either. He began to search frantically, the road, the verge, the bushes, but nothing. He tried to flag down other drivers to help in his search, but no one stopped, and so, not knowing what else he could do, this was in the days before mobile phones and internet after all, he jumped back in his car, drove to the nearest police station, and told the officers that he'd just run someone over and now he couldn't find them. The reaction of the police officers was not what he was expecting. Seeing that he was extremely distressed, they duly searched the area and inspected Ian's car for signs of damage that would indicate he'd had a collision. On both counts, they were unable to find anything. But the police knew something Ian didn't. He wasn't the first person to run into their police station, shaking with fear and utterly convinced they had hit and killed a young female pedestrian, except they couldn't find her anywhere. The officers explained to the shaken man that there was a history of sightings in the area and that his experience was not unusual, but they never found anything in these cases, and this may just have to be written off as another sighting of the ghost of Bluebell Hill. To begin with, Ian was having none of it. He didn't believe in ghosts. And even if he had, this wasn't some pale diaphanous spectre. This was a real, solid girl he saw. A girl that looked right at him as she ran into the path of his vehicle. For days afterwards he was on edge, waiting, convinced that there would be a knock on the door and it would be the police, informing him that they had found a body. But the knock never came. And not long after Ian's experience, another lone driver would face the same horror, dread, and confusion. Exactly 2 weeks later, almost to the hour, on Sunday the 22nd of November 1992, Chris Dawkins is driving home and passing through Bluebell Hill Village. In an interview, he explained that it was a familiar route and that he was paying particular attention to watch out for pedestrians on this stretch of road, as there were often kids playing about, even at night. Which is why he was so shocked when a young lady seemed to appear from nowhere and run out in front of his car, where she stopped and turned to look right at him as he tried but failed to brake in time, and his car ploughed into her. In an eerie repeat of Ian Sharp's experience, he screeched to a halt and tumbled shakingly from his vehicle, expecting the worst, but finding absolutely nothing. Poor Chris was only 19 and, almost hysterical with shock, he did the only thing he could think of in the moment and found a phone box to call his dad. Struggling to calm him down enough to get the full story, Chris's dad drove over to the scene as quickly as he could. By the time his dad arrived, it had occurred to Chris that the only place he hadn't looked was under his car, and in his traumatised state he couldn't bring himself to do so. He asked his dad, "Will you look?" Falteringly, but knowing it had to be done, the older man agreed. The exhale when he steeled himself to peer under the vehicle must have been audible. There was nothing there. Chris's dad knocked on the door of a nearby house and asked to use their phone to call the police and report the accident. But when the officers arrived, their search was just as fruitless, and once again they could find no sign of damage to the car. With Ian Sharp's experience fresh in their minds from only a fortnight ago, they had no choice but to inform Chris that they didn't think he'd hit anybody, and explain to him about the common sightings of the ghost of Bluebell Hill. In a later interview, Chris described his initial thoughts on being told that he'd probably seen a ghost, and his reaction was very similar to Ian Sharp's. He thought ghosts were insubstantial, ethereal things like TV and films made them out to be, but moreover, he thought they weren't real, and certainly not the fully formed flesh and blood young woman who would run out in front of his car, looking straight at him the whole time, with big eyes in a roundish face. These two witnesses, despite having experienced such similarly traumatic and inexplicable things a mere fortnight apart, never met to compare notes, indeed hadn't spoken to one another, until 2 years later when the BBC made a special programme looking at cases of the paranormal. It was called Out of This World, and the show brought both men into the studio to be interviewed, along with the BBC's standard fare panel of just opposing experts, this time consisting of an author of a best-selling book on the supernatural and a psychologist who seemed intent on convincing the two men that they'd merely witnessed an uncannily similar hallucination. But if they weren't believers before, having compared each other's descriptions of the young woman that they saw, the unlikely similarity may just have cemented their beliefs, and they made comment that, although previously unbeknownst to each other, their descriptions were nearly identical. The author on the panel, Lyle Watson, addresses the fact that Ian Sharp's story made the paper, so of course some people may have wondered if Chris Dawkins hadn't read this article and that this had planted the image in his mind. But Lyle Watson picks up on something quite crucial. The fact that the newspaper article that related Ian's experience had actually misquoted him, and the description that had made it to print was of a woman with short, dark hair. Yet that was never Chris's description. He had seen a woman with shoulder-length blonde hair. He just didn't happen to know that that was exactly what Ian had seen too. These two cases weren't the only sightings to make the paper. The first was back in 1974, when a bricklayer by the name of Maurice Goodenough collided with a girl who walked out from the edge of the road right into the path of his moving vehicle. Unable to brake in time, he hit her, in his words, with a hell of a bang. But this sighting wasn't quite the same as the two men some 18 years later, because when Maurice got out, the young girl was lying in the road, with skinned knees, a cut forehead, and was mumbling for her mother. She was only around 10 or 11 and had shoulder-length brown hair, a lacy white blouse, a skirt, and white ankle socks. Maurice carefully wrapped her in the rug from his car as he urgently tried to flag down other cars to help him, but no one stopped. Too worried to move her in case he worsened her injuries, he left her wrapped in the rug and sped to the nearest police station to fetch help. And this is where the stories come back into alignment, as when the police arrived at the scene, the rug was still there, but the girl was nowhere to be found. The authorities' search on this occasion even included tracker dogs hunting through the woods on the slopes of Bluebell Hill. But nothing was ever found, and no explanation was ever forthcoming. Oddly, when the newspapers got hold of this story, they linked the sighting to a traffic accident that had occurred on that stretch of road 9 years earlier, when a car carrying a bride-to-be and her 3 bridesmaids, travelling home from the bride's hen night, spun out of control and collided with a Jaguar. Sadly, 3 out of the 4 women lost their lives, 1 on that very stretch of road. Of course, this dreadful tragedy, made all the more poignant by its occurrence the night before the young woman's wedding, is the kind of thing that will stay in the public mind for many years. So perhaps it's not surprising that the press latched onto this sad story as a possible cause for the hauntings. But the link to Maurice Goodenough's experience has perplexed paranormal enthusiasts for many years, as the 10-year-old girl didn't seem to have much in common with the car of young women who was so tragically caught up in the terrible road accident. More than this, I did find mention of 2 witnesses claiming to have experienced an actual hitchhiking ghost on this notorious stretch of road. Kent Online names Bob Vanderpeer and James Skeen as both having picked up a passenger who inexplicably disappeared from the backs of their cars. But the first of these stories took place in 1962, 3 years before that car crash that is so regularly associated with the Bluebell Hill ghost. Another reference to a hitchhiking ghost sighting can be found in Neil Arnold's book Paranormal Kent, which relates the tale of a motorcyclist who picked up a girl asking for a lift in the area, only to find that she disappeared from his vehicle before he could complete the journey. This sighting took place in 1934. Some reports of seeing what's later recognised as an apparition wearing an old-fashioned dress and bonnet has led some to wonder if the ghost is in fact that of a maid who was murdered in the nearby woods in 1916. But the victim was 20 years old at the time of her death, and somehow it's just difficult to imagine a spirit from 1916 casually hopping into the backseat of a car or riding pillion on a motorbike. And there are other reports too that muddy the waters even further, with some witnesses who have encountered a terrifying, screaming, hag-like figure at the side of the road. So just what is going on at Bluebell Hill? Well, the BBC experts couldn't come to a conclusion either. The psychologist, Dr. Susan Blackmore, focused her attention on the abundance of nearby TV masts and telephone pylons in the area. The author, Lyle Watson, picked up, as I did, on the archaeology of the area and even outlines in a handy map graphic how the stretch of the A229 where Ian's sighting took place is flanked by the old Roman road on one side and the prehistoric trackway and burial chambers on the other. Neither notice anything unusual about the location of Chris's sighting, but in his book Paranormal Kent, Neil Arnold does, noting that the telephone box that Chris called his father from sat just outside the Medway crematorium. I'm not sure we'll ever be able to unpick just what is going on at Bluebell Hill, but it's certainly a curious place, and one that looks set to keep the hitchhiking ghost legend alive for some time yet.
And Bluebell Hill was actually suggested by one of our listeners, and we do love hearing suggestions from you, so keep them coming in. Now, we're going to travel across the pond now for an interesting derivation of the hitchhiking ghost, which is that of the prom ghost. I've not really heard of prom ghosts in the UK, mainly I suspect is that here we never really had proms, though they do seem to be becoming a little bit more popular, but even then they don't really have the same cultural impact as in the US. The city of Ogden in Utah has its own local legend of a prom ghost, and Jaden of the Straight Up Enigmas podcast got in touch to share her own personal encounter with it. She writes, "Every town has its local legends. For Ogden, Utah, a city about 20 to 25 minutes north of where I grew up, it's no different. The Ghost of Flo, a 15-year-old girl with a forbidden love, is said to haunt the Ogden City Cemetery. The story goes that Flo was waiting for a ride from her boyfriend, a boy her parents didn't approve of, when she was hit by a car and killed by the curb. Some claim she will appear from behind her headstone if a driver points their car's headlights at the grave and flashes the lights 3 times. Supposedly, she will head towards the vehicle, mistaking the car for the ride she missed. A groundskeeper also claims to have heard unexplained sounds of children playing and laughing in the part of the cemetery known as Babyland, where many children and infants are buried. He also says he saw a man disappear, and during a lightning storm, he spotted a black-caped figure when lightning struck a tree. Local lore even says that Stephen King was inspired to write Pet Sematary after visiting the graveyard. I'm not sure about the other strange occurrences, but I do have my own personal experience with the Ghost of Flo. I've seen her with my own eyes. Like I mentioned before, I grew up just about 20 to 25 minutes south of Ogden, so when I was about 15 or 16, my friends and I heard all about a ghost named Flo, short for Florence, that hung around the cemetery in Ogden. My friend said she was the spirit of a girl who'd been hit by a car while waiting for her prom date to come pick her up. The legend said that if you went to the cemetery at night, put your car in neutral, and shone your headlights 3 times on Flo's headstone, she'd appear in front of you in the road. My friends and I were very into supernatural stuff, so we got a huge thrill out of going to so-called haunted places. being the super smart teenagers that we were, one night my friends and I drove over to Ogden Cemetery really late at night, and we had to loop around a couple of times because we saw another car in the graveyard probably trying to do the exact same thing as us. We finally parked our car on top of this little hill so that we were slightly facing downhill. It was a tiny little hill, barely high up at all. We turned off our phones, my friend put his car in neutral, and as we rolled forward, he flashed the brights 3 times on the grave that was supposedly Flo's. A few seconds passed. Nothing happened. We were all quietly, nervously laughing, waiting for something to happen, when suddenly we all went completely silent. About 20 yards or so in front of us, this ball of green light, about the size of a basketball, appeared in the middle of the road and just hovered there. I remember it being completely silent in the car. The only sound I could hear was our breathing as we all watched this ball for a few seconds, and then it disappeared. I think I remember somebody started saying something like, "Did you guys see that?" when the form of a girl appeared in the same exact spot where the ball of light had been, about 20 yards in front of us in the middle of the road. And just like the ball, the girl sort of glowed with this greenish light. I could see her side profile. She was standing or hovering, facing away from us to my left. I could clearly see that she looked like a person. It wasn't just a vague, shiny form. I could see a head and arms hanging down loosely at her sides. She was wearing a flowy dress that went down to her ankles, and her hair was long. It almost looked like it was floating, like it was suspended in water. The figure appeared for only a few seconds, maybe only about 5 or 10, and then she vanished. She didn't move towards us, but one of my friends that was also with us says that he remembers her sort of moving off to the right and fading away. As soon as she was gone, I remember taking a deep breath as if I'd been holding my breath the whole time, and we all sat there in a stunned silence. Someone finally broke the silence, and then we were all asking each other, "Did you see that? Did you see that?" My friend turned on his car, and we drove forward straight through where Flo had been standing. I didn't feel scared necessarily. I didn't feel like Flo was malevolent or that she wanted to hurt us, but I just felt shaken up, and the whole way home, we were all just in awe at what had happened. We were seriously spooked, but mostly just dazed. Afterwards, I tried to do some research online to see what other people who had gone to the cemetery experienced. On one online forum, someone shared that they'd turned off their car and flashed the lights at the grave just like we had. This person said they also saw a young woman that was green and wearing a dress. I was pretty spooked knowing that at least one other person out there had seen the exact same thing as me and my friends. I did find online that the Florence whose headstone we'd shone our lights on actually died of the flu, and not any kind of car accident. Who the ghost is then, I'm not sure. I still don't know if what I saw was really a ghost. I honestly have no idea what caused the apparition in the middle of the road. I've heard everything from a mirage to lights bouncing off the tombstones to swamp gas, but to me, none of those explanations really work. All I know is that to this day, all of my friends that were in the car with me that night still also remember seeing the ghostly green figure of a woman standing in the middle of the cemetery road.
Thank you to Jaden for sharing that story with us. That is such an unusual one. I mean, how many times is a local legend like that actually seen? And the bit about the green light is odd because that's the second time in as many weeks I've heard a story that featured this really odd ball of green light as the precursor to seeing an apparition.
Oh, that's weird. That deserves a little bit more
investigation.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Jaden, for sharing that story. Jaden is from the Straight Up Enigmas podcast, which is definitely worth a listen. I'm just going to tell you an amusing little anecdote of the first time I listened to Straight Up Enigmas. At the moment, with everything that's going on, I tend to do my exercise at night when nobody else is around, and I can tell you that listening to Straight Up Enigmas really gets the heart racing when you're going for a walk at like 1 o'clock in the morning. Oh. As usual, I'll put links to Straight Up Enigmas in the show notes along with everyone else that's featured in the show. And we've got another one to feature in the show for you now. Our final story for today follows on quite nicely from that of Bluebell Hill and Tales of Hitchhiking Ghosts. It was provided by Eric and Jessica Carrier of the Prairieland Paranormal podcast and needs little introduction. So, with no further ado, we invite you to join Eric and Jessica as they share the story of Resurrection Mary.
Hey guys, this is Eric and Jessica Carrier, the hosts of the Prairieland Paranormal podcast. And we are excited to be part of this Halloween special sponsored by Knock Once for Yes. Lil and Fitz, thank you for this opportunity. We are going to share with you one of our favorite spooky tales, a chilling legend from our own state of Illinois, the legend of Resurrection Mary.
Resurrection Cemetery is in Justice, Illinois, a suburb of southwest Chicago. It was consecrated in 1904 by the Roman Catholic Church. The cemetery is large and covers 540 acres. In fact, it is one of the largest cemeteries in the United States, and its triangular shape and weird happenings have dubbed it the Resurrection Triangle. One of the cemetery's most beautiful but daunting features are the 2 large brass metal gates that greet its visitors. The gates, long greened from oxidation and time.
In 1976, a close inspection of the gates and a trained eye would have revealed something very unusual. 2 of the bars were bent, a hand's length apart, and scorched with 2 black sooty handprints, complete with fingerprints. The prints had been discovered by Officer Pat Homa of the Justice Police Department after responding to a call that a woman was locked in the cemetery and shaking the gates in an effort to get out.
While the city of Chicago was quick to say that it was caused by a work truck that had backed into the fence, locals told a very different story. The marks, of course, were caused by Mary, the cemetery's resident ghost. Crowds of people gathered and came to see the marks, and soon the city cut the bent bars out and replaced it with wire fencing until the bars could be straightened and replaced. Once the bars had been straightened and replaced, they still prominently displayed the blackened areas that seemed to never oxidize back to the gate's green color. They remained in that state until 2002, when the cemetery replaced the entire front gate.
The story of Resurrection Mary is a story of a beautiful blonde, lost love, a lonely highway, tragedy, and a hitchhiking ghost. While Mary's exact origin story is not known, legends abound. The most prominent says Mary's story began at the O. Henry Ballroom in the mid-1930s. The ballroom, now called the Willowbrook Ballroom, sits just off of Archer Avenue in Willow Springs. It was a popular place for swing and big band dancing and booked the best bands of the day. And because of its secluded nature and reputation for booze, prostitution, and gambling, young people from all over Chicago's South Side flocked there.
Mary was at the O. Henry Ballroom with her boyfriend that fateful night. They spent the night dancing and drinking, but at some point,
seriously,
their fun turned into an argument.
You can just leave.
And Mary stormed out, facing a cold walk home, alone. But as fate would have it, as she walked up Archer Avenue alone, she was struck in a hit-and-run accident. As the driver fled, Mary was left to die.
Her parents, grieving, buried her in Resurrection Cemetery in her favorite white party dress. And it wasn't long before motorists started picking up a beautiful young blonde woman dressed in white on Archer Avenue, only to have her vanish from their vehicles at the gates of Resurrection Cemetery.
But is there any truth to this legend? Did Mary exist and die on Archer Avenue? Or is this nothing more than an urban legend, folklore, and just another of dozens of stories about vanishing hitchhiker spirits? This legend, while very similar to many others, does however seem to stem from at least some truth and offers us evidence, multiple eyewitness accounts.
The first encounters with Mary started in 1934, when numerous drivers reported that a girl tried to flag them down for rides on Archer Avenue, or attempted to jump onto the running boards of their vehicles as they passed by. Several people have had face-to-face encounters with Mary. One such encounter occurred in 1939, when Jerry Paulus reported spending almost an entire evening with the ghost. I was at the Liberty Grove and Hall, which is a dance hall, and I spied this really attractive blonde sitting in the corner. She must have sat there for a couple hours before I got the nerve to ask her to dance. She accepted, and we spent the next several hours just dancing and talking. One thing that I noticed about her was that her skin was very cold, icy really to the touch. As the evening concluded, I asked her if I could drive her home, and she agreed, giving me an address on South Demon Avenue. As we left, she asked me if I could go the way of Arch Avenue, which was strange because it was really out of the way, but I didn't care. I just wanted to spend as much time with her as I could. As I approached Resurrection Cemetery, she asked me to pull over and let her out there. I was confused, but I did pull over, and I didn't understand why she wanted to get out at such a dark and odd location. There was a row of houses just off of Archer, and I assumed that she was going to go over there. I asked her if I could walk her home. She declined and turned in a seat facing me, and that's when she said,
"This is where I have to get out, and where I'm going, you cannot follow."
I didn't understand, and before I could respond, she jumped out of the car and ran towards the gates of the Resurrection Cemetery. And right there, before my eyes, I swear to you, she vanished.
The next day, Jerry decided to go to the address she had given him, but the woman who answered the door told him that he could not have possibly spent the evening with her daughter, as she had been dead for 4 years. Paulus was shown a picture by the woman and positively identified her as the woman he had spent the evening with. There are many such encounters with Mary, all ending the same way, with her suitor for the evening shocked and confused at the gates of Resurrection Cemetery.
There were multiple Mary sightings in the 1930s, but the encounters seemed to die off until the 1970s when they picked up again. It was during this time that the cemetery was undergoing some renovations that may have caused Mary some unrest.
Bob Main, the night manager at a nightclub named Harlow's, had 2 encounters with Mary in 1973. She appeared twice in the nightclub. He said that her expression seemed to look right through you, and also described her appearance.
She was about 24 to 30 years old, 5'8" or 9. Slender with yellow blonde hair to the shoulders as she wore in these big spoolie curls coming down from the high forehead. She was really pale, like she powdered her whole face and body. She had on this old dress that was yellowed, like a wedding dress left in the sun. She sat right next to the dance floor and wouldn't talk to anyone. She danced all by herself, this pirouette type dance. People were saying, "Who is this bizarre chick?" The strangest thing was, even though we carded everyone who came in there, nobody, either night, ever saw her come in, and they never saw her leave.
When Maine and the other staff members tried to talk to the young woman to see if she was okay, the woman only shook her head.
Another well-documented Mary encounter happened in 1979 to a cab driver that apparently came in contact with her near the intersection of Archer Avenue and Willow Springs Road. This story appeared in the Suburban Tribune and was told by the cabbie, who identified himself as Ralph.
It was a Thursday night, and I was lost. I dropped this big spender way the hell down in Palo Heights, or Hills, or someplace like that, and I was trying to make my way back to the tollway. I just turned onto Archer, down there where it's still a lonely road, especially at midnight. and there she was. She was standing there with no coat on at the entrance to this little shopping center. No coat. And it was one of those really cold ones, too. She didn't put her thumb out or nothing like that. She just looked at my cab. Of course, I stopped. I figured maybe she had car trouble or something. She hopped right in the front seat, and she had on this fancy kind of white dress, like she'd been to a wedding or something. And those new kind of disco-type shoes with the straps and that. She was a looker. A blonde. I mean, I didn't have any ideas like that. She was young enough to be my daughter. 21 tops. I asked her where she was going, and she said she had to get home. I asked her what was wrong, if she'd had car trouble or what, but she really didn't answer. She was fuzzy. Maybe she'd had a couple of drinks or something and was just tired. I don't know. Oh, the only thing she really did say was that the snow came early this year. Other than that, she just nodded when I asked, and if we were supposed to just keep going up Archer. Mainly, she was just looking out the windows at the snow and the trees. It was obvious that her mind was a million miles away. Maybe she'd smoked something, or was on drugs or something. Who knows? A couple of miles up Archer, and there she jumped with a start like a horse. I was like, here! I hit the brakes. I looked around and didn't see any kind of house. Where? I said. And then she sticks her arm out and points across the road to my left and says, there. And that's when it happened. I looked to my left at this little shack, and when I turned, she was gone. Just vanished. And the door never opened. May the good Lord strike me dead. It never opened.
There are literally dozens and dozens of stories just like these, making Resurrection Mary the most seen ghost in the Windy City. Even though sightings and encounters have slacked off in the recent years, they still occur. Does Mary exist? If you ever find yourself along Archer Avenue, late at night, perhaps you can ask her. Don't be surprised if you find yourself magically enchanted by a ghostly beauty called Resurrection Mary.
All right, folks, we hope you've enjoyed our telling of the legend of Resurrection Mary. The Prairieland Paranormal Podcast is an exploration into all things paranormal with dramatic storytelling, historical research, relevant science, and witness accounts. If you are interested in hearing more of our podcast, you can find us online at www.prairielandparanormalpodcast.com or through your favorite podcast player. We hope to see you soon.
Eric and Jessica, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for letting us share that on our show. I now feel a bit like we don't put enough effort into our sound effects. That was perfect for our Halloween episode, and what an interesting story.
And so, I'm afraid that is all the stories we have for you this episode. We hope that you enjoyed them, and do try not to worry too much that the chills you might have felt might not have been the chill air of winter, but the gentle touch of something not quite of this world. Thank you to everyone that shared their stories with us, and you can find links to the other podcasts featured on the show notes on the website, which is where you can also submit your own paranormal experiences, and we're always excited to receive them. Not Once VS is entirely supported by our patrons, and if you'd like to help us keep producing the show, then please do consider becoming our patron from as little as $1 a month. We've even got some more patron bonuses coming soon, so watch this space. The show is produced by my production company, Narrative Audio, and if you're a podcaster and you'd like to outsource your editing and post-production, then please do get in touch. Stay safe, and we hope you'll join us again soon for another episode of Not Once VS. But until then, Happy Halloween!